All right, we have lots and lots of history we're covering today. So we're still in the intertestamental era. This will take us another week after today. You're going to get one of the deepest dives into this period of time that believers usually ever get. But I connected it to the Old Testament, and it will connect to the New Testament in ways that I think you will see, and the whole New Testament should have a completely different outlook and context and background on it once we get into it. So last week we covered the Apocrypha, which are a lot of the books. This time we are actually jumping into the history, and we're going to be reviewing the Persian Empire and explaining how the Macedonian kingdoms play out. And we're going to connect that to the prophecy in Daniel chapter 11. And eventually we're going to get to the books of the New Testament. We're not there yet. We're still getting there. So, Old Testament closes. We have a whole bunch of Persian emperors. So find your Persian emperor sheet there for you, for frame of reference. Now, this is a lot of review, so hopefully you remember some of this. You've got your map of Persia. Persia was the largest empire in the world up to that point in time. It had been preceded by the Babylonian Empire, and before that the Assyrian Empire, but neither of them covered this geographic extent. It stretched all the way from the far stretches of Turkey, modern Turkey, so there were no Turks in Turkey back then, and it even had a piece of Thrace and Macedonia, and it went all the way over to India, and included Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and a lot of the other stands in Central Asia. Which one?
Pakistan.
Yeah, Pakistan actually, because it didn't hit actual India, just the Indian subcontinent. It was in the Pakistan side of the Indian subcontinent.
So the off-brand India?
West India, not off-brand India. I think we mentioned this verse last spring in Daniel 11. He says, "Now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece." So reviewing those emperors, most of them actually are found in the Old Testament. We have Cyrus the Great, who was the first one. He was the one who took out the king of Babylon and created the Median Persian Empire. And we see a quote in Ezra 1:1 here. "In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation through all his kingdom and also put into writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem." Now Cyrus was actually quite old at this point in time, and he died just a handful of years later. He was followed by Cambyses, his son. Cambyses invades Egypt, but I don't believe he is mentioned directly in the Bible. However, the next one, who's got a lot of crazy names, sometimes he's referred to as Artaxerxes, sometimes he is Gaudamus, sometimes he's Magus. He reigns a very short period of time. He's a usurper of the throne, but he's the one who stopped the rebuilding of the temple that Cyrus had ordered. We find this in Ezra 4. He is quoted as saying, "Therefore make a decree that these men be made to cease, and that the city be not rebuilt until a decree is made by me, and take care not to be slack in this matter. Why should damage grow to the hurt of the king?" He didn't last long on the throne. Darius comes to the throne. This is not the Darius that threw Daniel into the lion's den. That was a different Darius. But this Darius is thought by some people, including James Ussher, to be the Darius who was in power in the days of Esther. And he is the one who also restarted the rebuilding of the temple. But we see this in Esther 1:1, the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus was set on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign. And we know it was one of the more powerful Persian emperors who actually did have a kingdom stretching all the way from Egypt. Ethiopia would be Kush, which would be the southern part of Egypt, over towards modern-day Pakistan. And the next one, Xerxes the First, he's the one who launched the second great invasion of Greece, and he's mentioned prophetically in Daniel 11:2. He's that guy who says, when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. What that's referencing to is his army was filled with people from all across his kingdom. It was not just Persians in the army. He had Bactrians, he had Indians, he had Cushites. Every province sent forth a contingent, and so it was this very interesting mass of army moving across there. Nobody knows how big that army was or was not, because all the ancient authors have different ways of tallying it, but some people put the crowd up to 5 million people. That would include all of the women that came along, wives and others, and all of the armorers and all the craftsmen and service providers for the army and so forth. Large groups of men attract huge followings of people who are willing to make money off of their concentration. But you also just have to feed them. But there were so many of them that as they would go through Greece, the rivers would fail because they would drink them dry. So it was no small group of people. And the Greeks were able to overcome them in various ways. That was in 590. It was the Battle of Salamis, naval battle, that they defeated them. It was under Darius the First, not Xerxes. Mm-hmm. So then, if you remember, prophecy, we learned, has this perspective where you can see the high points, and then you've got this giant valley that just is not as significant as the peak in front of it. And from Daniel's perspective, Xerxes is the last great king of Persia. But if you look on your sheet, how many more great emperors of Persia are there?
Quite a few.
Yeah, a decent amount.
Quite a few. Those are all overshadowed and blocked from view because the next thing that gets mentioned is the guy from Greece, Alexander the Great, and he gets a lot of mentions in Daniel because he was a very prominent figure looking forward in time. So Daniel 7, it says, "After this I looked, and behold another beast, that is, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." So that is one of the first images of the Macedonian empires, which oftentimes in the Old Testament are referred to as Greece. Then in Daniel 11:3, in this chapter, it says, "Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills." And that is an apt description of him. Greater detail is in Daniel chapter 8, this prophecy here about him. It says, "I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last." And that is the Persian Empire. It says, "I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great," which is a good explanation for how the Persian Empire is enormous compared to any previous empire. No one could stand against him. "And as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. The ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And then, at the end of the chapter, the interpretation is spelled out a little more detailed, like verses 20 through 22 says, "As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power." So we're jumped all the way here forward to Alexander the Great. And this prophecy was given about 200 years before he comes around in 530 to 540 BC. And it's very accurate in its look. Now you see how big the Persian Empire is. And on the far western side of that map, you'll see Greece, and Macedonia is up in the north. And Macedonia gains its independence, but in 336, when Alexander the Great actually gains power, you see on this map, Macedonia is a relatively small kingdom compared to the whole Persian Empire. So the red area there, labeled Macedon, is Macedonia proper. Now, Alexander the Great's father and him had already conquered Thrace, which is the lighter orange above Macedonia. And so that's already been territory subjugated by the Macedonians. And the yellow down below and the light orange is the Corinthian League. And that is a group of city-states that were conquered by the Macedonians during the reign of Philip, Alexander the Great's father. And they were subjugated, and so they're under their hegemony. So that is why when the Old Testament refers to it as the king of Greece, it's relatively accurate because Alexander was the king of Macedon, but he was also the king of the Greek city-states and Thrace as well. And Macedonia is kind of like the neighbor who realized that the Greek city-states are really cool and I want to be like them, but we're going to conquer them and then we're going to be just like them. And Rome actually did this with Greek culture too, Athenians specifically. So the Macedonians, while they had been an independent kingdom, independent culture, they really absorbed and emulated Greek culture in a lot of different ways and assimilated into Greek culture quite thoroughly. So they were Greek in a lot of ways. You have a question?
No.
Nope. Oh. But anyway, that's a relatively small starting point. And then if you flip to your map of Alexander the Great's conquests, you can see how he traversed across the earth. And as you can see, he made really good headway going across Asia Minor or Turkey at first. And that's where he first started racking up victories against the Persian Empire. And then he spent a year laying siege to the city of Tyre, and that is actually prophesied in the book of Ezekiel. And Tyre was an island off the coast, and it was impregnable. If you remember, Nebuchadnezzar had actually laid siege to the city of Tyre for 30 years and failed to take it. And Alexander the Great wanted to be greater than Nebuchadnezzar and was not going to let Tyre stand in the way of him being an amazing conqueror. And so he leveled the old city, which was on land, and made a causeway about a mile across the bay out to the island so that he could march his army out and take it in a frontal assault. And it took about 9 months, and the Tyrians fought very viciously. If I remember right, they would heat up sand in the ovens and then pour that down on the Macedonians because that would get between their armor and their skin and burn them, and it was just miserable. It was a very vicious fight, and it wasn't good for the people at Tyre when they lost. And after that, he just walked into Egypt, and the Egyptians were like, "We're not going to fight against you. Please come free us from the Persians. You can be our victor and savior, right? And one of the things Alexander the Great did as he was conquering pieces of the Persian Empire is whatever they used to pay in tribute to the Persians, he would just say, you can pay that to me now. And so city-states would be like, we can either pay this to the Persians and we get attacked and defeated, or we can just pay it to him and he doesn't attack and defeat us. It's a win-win. And sometimes he'd lower their taxes, and so there was other opportunities for them too. So if the Persians were not actively defending in the area, they oftentimes just surrendered to Alexander the Great, and that was very much the way Egypt took it. And the second really big battle against the Persian Empire was at Gaugamela. I think that's in Iraq area on your map. Is there a battle there indicated on the map? Gaugamela, G-A-U-G.
Is that the one he stayed up all night?
Yes.
Strategizing?
Yep, so Alexander the Great was an amazing general, and he had 35,000 men, and he was facing a Persian army of about 60,000 men, and he had to figure out how to overcome that numerical discrepancy. He stayed up all night and figured out how to do it, and then he overslept crazy bad late into the next day. And I think it was about 4 in the afternoon, they finally got him awake to be like, so how are we fighting this battle?
Imagine he forgets while he's sleeping.
Yeah. But anyway, so they very quickly break through the Persian lines, and Alexander goes off attacking Darius, and there's actually a fresco or I don't know if it's a fresco. What is that when they do little shards of pottery to make
Mosaic.
a mosaic? There's a famous mosaic of Alexander the Great almost capturing Darius III in the Battle of Gaugamela that has survived. And it's a good representation of Alexander the Great's face and Darius III's face. But after that, the Persians fell back really deep into the Persian Empire, and Alexander the Great just walked into all the capital cities in Iran, including Susa. And he had to chase down Darius the Great. Darius III got killed by somebody, and then Alexander the Great was like, well, we have to keep attacking and conquering something, right? And so he went all the way over, and he got into Pakistan and crossed a few rivers the Persians didn't, and then his army was about to mutiny, and so he was realizing there's a lot more world out there to conquer, but my soldiers might not have the stomach for it. And so the way they used to, cook things up back then is they would always ask the gods for omens as to whether they would, be able to attack and be victorious. And that day Alexander the Great cooked it up so that the omens would all be bad and negative. And so in his great wisdom, he would heed the advice of the gods and turn south and head towards the mouth of the Indus River instead of continuing attacking into India.
Right.
Yep. But he did attack and conquer just a little bit more than the Persians had. And then he made his way back to Babylon, and then he was figuring out, hey, there's all of the North African area. We can conquer Spain, and we can conquer Rome. And then if he had lived, he probably would have had an empire that stretched from the far side of India, because he would have gone back over there,
Oh, for sure.
all the way to Spain.
So, would that be the...
And you did that all in 7 to 10 years?
He left in 334, and he died in 323.
So in 11 years you conquered
11 years. Mm-hmm.
all of the known world of the Israelites?
Yeah. Yep, because they didn't know about China. They didn't know about any
Spain.
kingdoms
They didn't know
further
about
over in
Russia.
India. They knew about Spain, but there wasn't much there.
Oh.
They
It
knew
was
about
really
Spain?
sparsely populated. Yeah, they knew about it.
How about Russia?
Yeah, that wasn't really populated. It was just a wasteland.
Why?
So outside these borders, it's really sparsely populated, nomadic tribal peoples. And so Arabia is just, there's nothing there hardly. There's probably some pretty decent kingdoms down south in Africa, but it's really hard to get down there because the Nile River is not easy to traverse once you get past the first cataracts.
In this time there were small kingdoms, but there wasn't anything big or substantial.
Right.
It would have been the West Africa that would have had
Yep.
the good stuff.
Yep. But even in Roman periods, most of Europe was too sparsely populated to actually be worth conquering because you couldn't tax the peasants you invade. They would just move out and then there was no revenue. So,
Had people crossed the land bridge into North America yet?
oh yeah, there was people in the Americas 1,000 years before this.
Okay.
So, anyway, that is how we shift into Macedonian Empire, which, as the prophecy says, the first king is great, and then it ends up being in 4. We see this in Daniel 11, verse 4. As soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these.
So did he just not have a son, or what?
What was it?
One of his wives was pregnant. Ooh, I didn't even spell that right. Roxanne, who he picked up along the way, was pregnant with a baby who did turn out to be a son. But as he was on his deathbed and knew he was dying, his generals asked him, "To who do you give the kingdom?" And his response was, "To the strongest." So imagine being the most amazing military general the world has ever seen and having 42 amazingly capable lieutenant generals underneath you that are why you've been so amazing, and telling them that whichever of you is the most awesome gets to have the kingdom.
Oh.
It's a battle royale.
It's a
between his
bloodbath.
lieutenant generals.
Yes, it was kind of interesting. I was actually reading First Maccabees last night, and it talks very fondly about Alexander the Great. And then it says, "And the kingdom fell to his generals, who unleashed horrible tribulations upon the earth." Like, it does not speak well of his generals in any way, shape, or form.
So evidently, his generals got a little bit greedy.
Yeah, like, it is complicated history. I would love to do a year-by-year map of how things shift around, but there's like 40 of them. And there's various alliances that get formed, and they hold this territory for a while, and they hold that territory for a while. And there's this loyalist by the name of Eumenes who is still trying to preserve the idea that Alexander the Great's son is eventually going to get the throne. We really do have a single empire here. And so, like, in the middle of the civil wars, he sends out this requisition order to get horses from the royal imperial horse herds that were in northern Iraq or something at the time, and it was just like, this guy is too loyalist. But anyway, after 42 years of wars and kingdoms rising and kingdoms falling and alliances rising and alliances falling, it boils down to these guys: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And one of them, it wasn't Lysimachus, I'm thinking it was Seleucus, was the last of the 40 alive. Everybody else died in battle or died and passed a kingdom on to their son. Ptolemy had the most stable kingdom of this entire period. He went to Egypt right away and established himself there, and nobody kicked him out of Egypt. It was very easy to defend, really.
Oh yeah, because you just have a tiny little land bridge.
Tiny little land bridge. And Seleucus got Asia Minor all the way to Bactria. So if you look at that next map,
Macedonian kingdoms.
yes, this has a few extra kingdoms on there too, but this gives you a good breakdown of how this works out. So Cassander gets Macedonia and Greece, and that's the green area, and so that's the homeland. Lysimachus ended up with Thrace and pieces of Asia Minor, and that was a very fluid situation. It's moving all the time, constantly moving. Seleucus gets Asia Minor all the way over to Bactria, and that also is fluid, and that kingdom only gets smaller over time. It never gets any greater.
I can imagine.
And Ptolemy has Egypt, but sometimes he has pieces of Asia Minor too. And the land of Israel, the Holy Land, is caught between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and it goes back and forth several times through several wars, which is why the writer of First Maccabees could talk about how the generals of Alexander unleashed all kinds of horrible evils and tribulations on the earth, because that was the front lines very often.
Whereas Alexander, the Israelites probably just said, hey, you know, you can, or the people living in the land, presumably the Israelites were just like, hey, yeah, you can We'll just tribute to you instead of Persia.
Yeah, actually, there is a story, and I'm not sure how historically accurate it is, but there's a story that when Alexander the Great had completed the siege of Tyre and was on his way down to Egypt, the Jewish high priest of the time pulled Alexander the Great aside and read to him the book of Daniel and said, "This is who you are. This is what's going on." And so that's why the Jews submitted readily to him, because they identified him as the king from Greece that was going to overthrow the Persian Empire, and no one could stand against him.
They were like, we're not going to try.
And so the Jews didn't even bother trying. I'm not positive that that's historically accurate and that it's not just an apocryphal. Would that have been awesome and cool, like the Jews identify Alexander the Great in the moment?
I mean, hey,
But I have heard that.
if it did happen, it would be great character growth for the Jewish high priests to go from opposing every single kingdom that God points over to have
Right.
dominion to submit.
Yep.
The recording's about to die.
Oh no, the recording's about to die?
No, his phone's about to die.
Your phone's about to die? Did you not charge it enough?
Not enough.
Can you go back 2 slides, please, for just a second?
Yep.
What percentages?
No.
That's next.
I think it can last long enough.
Better hope so.
We'll see.
I have faith.
20 minutes, 9%. We'll see.
It'll work. So, Castle.
Yes. And the sad thing is, like, those are only 4 survivors out of 40, and some of the other guys were amazing. And the one guy by the name of Antigonus had most of the empire at one time, and lost all of it, and lost his son, and so nothing ended up there. And to start with, another general by the name of Perdiccas, it looked like he was essentially going to get the throne, but then he got undermined. And it's just like. But then you read about the battles, and you have 10,000 men dying here, and 40,000 men dying here, and 60,000 men dying over here, and it's just battle after battle after battle, year after year after year after year. And you've got, yes, sieges, and cities are destroyed, and everybody's carted off and sold off into slavery, and it was just, it was so bad. Neil Chilke, my mentor, actually, like, I just got tired of reading it. I couldn't handle it anymore. It just kept fighting too much. And he really likes war history. He reads about World War II stuff all the time.
That's
Yes. I'm sorry, what?
Where did you read this?
I read this in the Annals of the World by James Ussher, which is a concentrated form of it. I'll bring that book in next week and you can see it.
So,
It's pretty epic.
It's a $60 book, but I highly recommend it if you have any affinity for history. I haven't finished it yet because it gets really thick at about 170. But
so, all these casualties you're mentioning, are those all Macedonians?
nope, they're recruiting from whoever's in their kingdom. So there's Macedonians dying, there's Egyptians dying, there's Bactrians dying. Like, you got these Bactrian camel-mounted
I was gonna
archers
say.
that are fighting all across the Middle East and over in Macedonia and Thrace, and it's just like those guys got around. But yes, they were all over the place. Anyway, so this relates very closely then here to the rest of Daniel chapter 11, because you have mentioned the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And you have to remember that almost all prophecy geographically is going to be referencing from the city of Jerusalem. And so if you look at the map here, relative to Jerusalem, the kings of the south are by the Ptolemaic kingdom down in Egypt, and the kings of the north are the Seleucid kingdom up in Syria, modern-day Syria, and it stretched all the way over to Bactria as necessary, but it was generally just north of them. And what I wanted to do was go through the rest of Daniel 11 here, or at least the next 15 verses, and connect these to people, because it sounds like you've got one king of the north and one king of the south, and it's really hard to capture the generations as they change and shift. But one of my other favorite historians, Jerome, from the 4th century, ended up writing a book about this and a commentary on the book of Daniel, and he was very well versed in history and connected all these verses to actual historical figures. And so that's what we're going to look at here. And so then if you look at your king lists, you'll see and the kings of the north and the kings of the south, when they reigned, but also the verses in Daniel that reference them. And so we'll start here. Daniel 11, verse 5 says, Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. And this is referencing Ptolemy the first and Ptolemy the second. And coming out of the chaos of the wars of the Macedonian generals, Egypt and the Ptolemaic kingdom down there was definitely one of the world's superpowers. They were a very strong kingdom. But it mentions the king and one of his princes. The prince would be Ptolemy II. Continuing in verse 6, it says, After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north, first reference to a king of the north, to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. One of the challenges of all this prophecy is that it uses pronouns to make references to all these different people, and figuring out which king it's actually referring to is a challenging part. So what happens is Ptolemy II gives his daughter Berenice to Antiochus II, and I don't think he's even the first king of the north. He's number 3 in the list, right? Yep, the first 2 don't get a mention. The third one gets a mention. And so she marries him, and we're already down to 252 BC. So a lot of time has gone by since Alexander the Great died, 71 years to be precise.
Yeah.
That didn't go well for her. She dies in 246 with all of her attendants in a violent palace intrigue type situation. And so that causes more problems, because we see in verse 7, And from a branch from her roots one shall arise in his place, and he shall come against the army, and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. And it's Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, who comes and attacks Seleucus II, which is the next king of the north, and Ptolemy III just completely obliterates the kingdom to the point where the Ptolemaic kingdom extended all the way into Babylon and large pieces of Asia Minor. And the Seleucid kingdom was pushed way over into modern Iran and Bactria and India. They were really out for the count for a while there. Next verse, next generation, almost. So then it says, He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. So Ptolemy III completely loots the Seleucid kingdom from Babylon all the way back, and it was after defeating him in 245. And ironically, in the process of doing that, he collects all the old Egyptian gods that Cambyses, the son of Cyrus the Great, had looted from Egypt and carted off to Babylon. And so you've got a 200-year hiatus, and that's what it's referring to when it says that he shall carry off to Egypt their gods. That's actually the gods of the Egyptians going back to Egypt. Do you have a question? Okay.
Oh, Dad, I had a question about
Yes.
that. So when Ptolemies are around, or,
Yep.
yeah, are pyramids built?
Oh yeah, the pyramids were built in the days of Abraham.
Oh.
Yeah, the pyramids are starting to fall apart. They've been a tourist attraction for a long time. And, yep, the Sphinx has been around, and all the kings buried in the Valley of the Kings have been dead for 1,000 years, and
Holy buckets.
Egypt is very old, ancient, and
Wait, so this isn't like Egyptian history that's contested in any way? This is very solid.
this is very solid. Stuff is pegged down to the dates.
Yeah.
This is just considered another dynasty. I think it's the 30th dynasty of the Egyptian history.
Holy buckets.
Yep. All right. Next verse in Daniel 11, verse 10, says, "His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress." So Seleucus II dies, and his sons, Seleucus III and Antiochus III, see their opportunity to carry the fight to Egypt. Seleucus III is only on the throne for 2 years, I think, and his friends, who were not such great friends, poison him while he's in Phrygia, and the army grabs Antiochus III and places him on the throne, and I believe Antiochus is surnamed the Great, because he was one of the greatest ones. So, the Seleucid kingdom goes from very badly damaged and wounded to very much on the ascendancy again here, as you'll see with Antiochus here, because he's mentioned in quite a few verses. And part of it is that the Egyptian kingdom just starts getting lousy kings, and that doesn't usually go well. So verses 11 and 12, it says, "Then the king of the south," and we're already down to Ptolemy IV now, "moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. And he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail." So Ptolemy IV actually defeats Antiochus the Great in a pretty significant battle, and tens of thousands of men died. The body count of those battles is actually known, reported, and is not really contested. It's within the realm of reason. He ends up concluding a peace treaty in 217, and that works for quite a while, actually. So for about 13 years, there's no war. Then in verse 13, we're down to the 5th Ptolemy here. It says, "For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south." So Antiochus the Great attacks Ptolemy V. This happens in 204. It's important to note that Ptolemy V is like a 5-year-old at this point in time. He's not actually ruling the kingdom. He's got an advisor ruling the kingdom. But Antiochus is actually allied with Philip, the king of Macedon. This is one of those few instances where another king actually gets mentioned in the prophecy. This talks about many shall rise against the king of the south. That many is a few other armies. And then in verse 14, it continues and describes an interesting thing here. "And the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail." And I think other translations might say the lawbreakers among your own people. And this is actually an interesting reference to the high priest Onias, who flees to Egypt with a great many Jews, and he ends up building a temple down in Egypt, just like the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. And this is actually prophesied to happen in Isaiah 19. And so he says, Daniel prophesies that your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision. And that's a reference back to a vision in Isaiah 19. And Onias, referencing that vision in Isaiah 19, decides he needs to do this. Micaiah, you want to look up Isaiah 19 and read verses 18 and 19? This was the novel thing I learned yesterday for the first time ever. So I had no idea this happened. And here it actually fulfills an Old Testament prophecy, which I also didn't know existed.
Verses
18 and 19. Read.
"In that day there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the City of Destruction. In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. When they cry to the Lord because of oppressors, he will send them a Savior and defender and deliver them."
That seems like more than 19.
Yeah.
Yep, okay.
Is that where it's talking about how Egypt will be like the third after Israel and one other kingdom?
20 is it will be a sign. And
Yeah, you weren't supposed to read 20.
Yeah, my
You're
bad.
supposed to stop at 19.
My bad.
Because prophecy likes to jump from one thing to something 1,000 years later. So I'm not sure exactly what verse 20 was referencing. But 18 and 19 were fulfilled here and were prophesied again also in Daniel.
The city of destruction.
Yeah, so Onias builds a temple, and it's been located in Egypt. They dug it up at about 1905, I think. And interesting thing about it is it gets completely destroyed by the Romans, because after the Jewish war that Josephus writes about and Jesus prophesies in Matthew 24, where the temple gets torn stone from stone, the Romans learned about another Jewish temple in Egypt, and they're like, we're not letting that become a center of Jewish worship because we've been there, done that, not doing that again. And so Vespasian, who is the emperor at the time, makes sure that that temple gets ripped stone from stone as well, and they didn't even leave the foundation left. They just completely dismantled it.
So how did we find it?
They found a foundation stone under the foundation. So you have to have
Foundation of the foundation.
yes, something like that.
Found
Okay.
a foundation stone or the foundation?
Foundation under the foundation stones. I'm not sure. I was like, I have to stop this thread. I have other things I have to do. But this is unique and interesting. I'm going to throw it in there because it is Daniel 11. And I was like, Jerome, we found stuff I've never heard about. What in the world? So, yes. Anyhow, that happens in between 200 and 170 BC. 170 is when the temple starts getting built, I believe. There's some fuzzy dates on that, and I couldn't sort out all the options. But anyway, Daniel 11, verse 15. We're back to Antiochus the Great. It says, Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. And Antiochus the Great besieged a general of the south by the name of Scopas in Sidon, that would be the fortress, or the well-fortified city, in 198 BC, and it falls to Antiochus. And so, up to this point, I think the Holy Land has largely been under the Ptolemies, and
Is that like Sidon and Gomorrah?
no, Sidon,
Oh, Sidon.
Tyre and Sidon.
Tyre and Sidon, Phoenician cities on the coast. And this is when Israel shifts to being part of the northern kingdom, and the boundary of the Seleucid kingdom shifts down to the southern boundary of Judah. Then in verse 16, But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. As I mentioned, Antiochus the Great then marches into Judea. He's not heavily contested at all. He just walks right in, and that's in 198. And then verse 17 is really fascinating, because this is when Rome comes onto the scene. Almost. Nope, I'm jumping. Next verse. 18 is when Rome comes on the scene. 17, we'll see here. It says, He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. So after conquering into Egypt, Antiochus the Great then tries to pass himself off as the great benevolent protector of Ptolemy V and promises him his daughter. And they're betrothed. Yeah, he's pretty young still.
Okay.
12-year-old maybe. So, anyhow, so Antiochus the Great is like, I can give him my daughter, and my daughter can help undermine the kingdom, and they'll become my vassal state, and this will be great. And his daughter does not remain loyal to Antiochus, and rather shifts her loyalties to Ptolemy V. And Ptolemy's advisors saw what was coming, and so they made sure to make that sure Antiochus's plan does not work. And so it's kind of crazy, because you have Daniel prophesying this a few hundred years in advance and nailing the details very precisely. Gives him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. He's trying to undermine Egypt. It fails. While he's trying to get his daughter to work her magic in Egypt, he gets bored. And so then in verse 18, afterward he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. So Antiochus the Great shifts his directions from south to west, and he starts attacking across Asia Minor to the coastlands. And this would be the island of Rhodes, another island of Samos he actually gets. And he captures the city of Ephesus on the coastlands of Asia Minor there, and is trying to hold that and run his campaign out of there. And at this point, he got too close to the Romans, and they start sending support over to all these small Greek kingdoms that they are trying to become the protector of. And a Roman by the name of Scipio Africanus, who is no less than the general that defeated Hannibal the Great, which is the second greatest general of antiquity, second only to Alexander the Great. And Scipio Africanus defeated him, and Antiochus the Great got Hannibal and hires him to be one of his generals. And so the Romans are like, we'll send Scipio over to deal with Hannibal over there too. And so Scipio defeats Antiochus in 189. This is after a few years of war. And that is why it says a commander shall put an end to his insolence, not another king. Because Scipio was not the consul, he was not, Rome didn't have a kingdom, they were run by the Senate back then. And so they were a republic, and they sent a military commander, and the prophecy specifies commander, not king. Very good precision.
Hannibal would disagree with you on that, right?
Yes, Hannibal would disagree with me. However, at that time in his life, he might have recognized, no, Alexander the Great did accomplish everything he wanted to. Hannibal just got dealt a really weak superpower to be general of. But he was an amazing general. He didn't have stomach to lay siege to a city. That was one of the differences I picked out when I was reading about Alexander the Great and Hannibal. Is Alexander the Great was like, there's a city, I want to take him down. And he laid siege to cities one after the other. And he withstood 9 months of the siege of Tyre, because most generals get bored and they're like, there's nothing happening, I'm not going to waste my time here. They want a good fight out in the open. And Alexander the Great was like, to heck with that. In fact, on his march back from Pakistan to Iran, they found a few cities that still needed to be laid siege to. And in one of those battles, none of his men wanted to climb the ladder and go up on the wall. And so Alexander the Great was the first one to climb the ladder. He gets up on the wall, stands there just long enough to be a really good target for a bow, and then he jumps into the city. And all of his soldiers saw that, and they all started climbing up the ladder. 2 of them make it to the top before so many are on the ladder that the ladder breaks. And so 2 men land next to Alexander inside the city wall, which was a good thing because Alexander the Great actually gets wounded pretty seriously really fast because there's 3 of them inside the city, and everybody else is like, we got to find another ladder because our king is on the inside of the city. So Hannibal would never do that. Granted, he didn't have the size of army necessary usually to lay siege to the size of cities he was looking at. Like, nobody wanted to march an army into Rome because there were so many peasants there that the army would have to have been several times larger to have any chance of just keeping the peasantry at bay. But anyway.
Yeah, that'd be difficult.
But he marched elephants through the Alps.
Yes, he did. All right, verse 19. Antiochus the Great shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land. He shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. And he, although he was the great, he dies a relatively ignominious death in 187. And he was definitely put in his place by the Romans. Verse 20. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. And that is referring to Seleucus IV, surnamed Philopator. He reigns for 12 years, and almost nothing of consequence happens in his 12 years. And so that is what is referenced. And he shall be broken, but it wasn't in battle. He didn't fight wars. He didn't fight battles. Nothing great happens. And we're going to end here with verses 21 and 22. It says, "In his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant." And this is where Daniel 11 becomes a little more tricky to interpret, because it is definitely referring to Antiochus IV, who we'll get into greater detail next week. But as it's being prophesied here, Antiochus IV does not fulfill all the details or even the fullness of what is described, although he's a shadow of what is to come. And because it's prophecy, there's several schools of thought as to how this should be rendered. And Jerome actually wrote a huge debate, or part of the debate back in antiquity, as to how this should be understood and such. He was of the opinion that Antiochus IV was a type of the coming Antichrist. And this is an Old Testament thing where Isaac was a type of the Messiah, because Isaac was offered up on the altar on the mountain where it says, "The Lord shall provide," and on the mountain of the Lord it was provided. Now Isaac was not the Messiah, was he? No, and he didn't die.
Wait, so that was the mountain that eventually Jesus was...
Yes. That
That's
was in the mountains where, yes, Jesus would as well. But Isaac is oftentimes understood to be a type, a shadow prophetically of the coming Christ. In the same way, David was the king, and he was the shepherd of the people Israel. He was also known to be a type of the Christ. He wasn't the Messiah, but his life foreshadowed Jesus, the coming king. Each of the judges, Samson in particular, was a type of the Christ. Samuel, as a prophet, was a type of the Christ, speaking the word of the Lord. And the high priest was also a type of the Christ. And so they're actually anticipating that there's going to be a prophet, there's going to be a priest, and there's going to be a Messiah, and he's going to be a king. They didn't realize that Jesus was going to be the prophet, the priest, and the king, 3 in 1. Amazingly. Anyway, so Antiochus IV, as we'll look at more detail next week, fulfills some of the rest of Daniel 11, but not all of it, and it seems to be a prophecy that has a 2-level application. One is lower level, Antiochus IV fulfills a chunk of it, and then it looks like it is actually looking forward to the Antichrist as well. And how you parse that out is going to be controversial, because we don't have the second fulfillment to know exactly which one fulfills which parts best and most. It was a crazy lot of history. The handouts connect your names and verses, and so you can review that way just reading through Daniel 11. But you recognize how detailed Daniel's prophetic history was, to the point where most skeptics would say, obviously this was written after all this happened, because how could he know with this much detail what was going to take place? Well, that's the Holy Spirit for you. So, all right, any questions before we conclude?
Please tell me you're going to do
Rome? Yes, that's next week. We transition from Persia into the Macedonian kingdoms. Next week we'll transition from the Macedonian kingdoms into Rome.